All right, if I can have your attention, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Suzi LeVine and Eric LeVine, as you could guess, a husband and wife team, working together and having traveled the world together, in particular to Switzerland at some point. Let me briefly give you the background. Of course, Suzi LeVine is well known on campus in particular because she has been a frequent visitor when she was the US ambassador to Switzerland. And former to this, she has been in the IT business, like Eric actually. And to make it very short, both of them have graduated from top US universities, Suzi from Brown and Eric from Harvard. Both of them have a career in the software industry as managers and entrepreneurs. And Suzi then had a career as a diplomat. That's a specialty in the United States, that you can be a software entrepreneur and become a diplomat. I find this quite cool. Maybe Switzerland could innovate there. I don't see it happen very quickly, but who knows? And while both were in Switzerland, as I said, we had frequent contacts, and this was always very interesting and enjoyable. In particular, Suzi LeVine was engaged with our program Internet pour les filles. She's very passionate, of course, in fostering more women careers in the IT industry. She has also become, and Eric, very interested in a Swiss specialty. So this is really a two-way street here, I want to insist. The Swiss specialty is not just Swiss wine. You can see Eric LeVine runs as a seller tracking software company, very interesting. But in particular in the Swiss specialty, which is the dual career, so not the dual career, it's Berufsbildung. I'm sorry, I always switch in German when I talk about Berufsbildung, God knows why, because we always talk about it when we are in Bern. La formation duale, I think it's called in French, ou l'apprentissage, apprenticeship. And what I find very interesting is that they studied this model, interacted with a lot of people, with the politicians, but also with major Swiss companies, where apprenticeship is one of the key ways to bring talent into companies. I remind you, especially people from outside the US, Switzerland tend to forget that the CEO, for example, of UBS is typically somebody who started as an apprentice, serving clients, at age 16 in a bank. And that's a perfectly interesting way to actually make a career in the Swiss system. It's also a way where young people have lots of options and lots of bridges if later on they want to switch from one of the systems to another. And so Suzi and Eric have been interested in this and also trying to evangelize in the United States. I know when Schneider Raman was visiting California, I was with him and I thought he would talk about the brilliance of the ETH system, and he was only talking about apprentices, which is just fine with me, of course, but it was a little bit surprising being in Silicon Valley and hearing the Minister of Science, only talking about apprenticeship. And so I would be very interested to hear Suzi's comment about and Eric's comment about our system. Unfortunately, I have to run to something else. And so I wish both a welcome to Switzerland. They are here because Suzi is getting a Dr Honoris Causa tomorrow at the Magistral of EPFL. And so they were gracious to visit for just a couple of days, and it's always a pleasure to see them. And with apologies, thank you very much, and I'll see you later today.
Perfect. See you later. A bientôt. Well, it is such a pleasure to be here with Eric as well. We have, since we've returned to the United States, been presenting and talking about this very much as a partnership and as a team. So I hope you don't get dizzy, but we're going to switch between the two of us over the course of the presentation. And in fact, I've usually got mouse control, so I'll take this side and he'll switch to that side. It's a little bit daunting to talk about this to a group who lives it, and to inside the country that has the gold standard for apprenticeship and jobs and career training, and even more strange to present it at the university where the lion's share of your students did not go through this path. But what we hope to do is to share with you how what exists here in Switzerland is in the process of transforming how the United States helps people better achieve access to the American dream. What we also hope is that we can instill an even deeper sense here in Switzerland to preserve, protect, and cherish this exceptional model that you have. And how do you elevate the prestige here even further and more deeply dedicate yourselves to its evolution and the innovation related to it? Now, when Eric and I were here, we visited hundreds of companies and met thousands of apprentices. And so this informed what we know, and really we saw nirvana, right? We saw what could an amazing economy do for helping all of its citizens advance. And what we learned was that the path to success has many beginnings, and they don't all start with a university degree. Not that they can't start with a university degree here in this fabulous university, but that it doesn't have to start that way. So the American dream is something that's really essential to that.
One other element that for us is deeply personal. So our kids are 12 and 15. And our son, who's 15, is a really bright kid who loves the classroom. In fact, Seattle doesn't handle snow as well as Switzerland does, so we get snow days. If too much snow falls, they close school. And he's angry because he's missing school, even though I point out to him that no one else is at school. Our daughter, who's 12, who actually does quite well in school, really doesn't enjoy the classroom. But from a very young age, when she got involved with robotics programs, she likes working with her hands. If we were to stay here, we have no doubt that she would want to do an apprenticeship. It just accommodates more naturally how she learns. And so for us, seeing two very bright kids, but who learn in very different ways, makes us realize how relevant this system can be. So when we talk about the American dream, actually I'm going to see if we can get interactive here. It's always hard. We're getting close to lunchtime. But I'd love people to shout out, when I say the American dream, what does that mean for you? Jim, come on, you're an American, let's go.
Start calling on people.
Opportunity for everyone.
Opportunity for everyone, okay? Success story starting from nothing. Home ownership, here we go. Freedom. So this is certainly an exercise we've done with a lot of rooms full of people. Suzi actually did it on her Facebook page. And I think a lot of the things that you tend to see are the notion that you can work hard and get ahead, create a better life for your kids than you had for yourself. Opportunity is very central to that. But increasingly, you also hear things like get a house, get a car, go to college or university. That is sort of winding into that dream.
Two great examples of the American dream, as you guys described it, right, opportunity and freedom, are these two fellas. On the left, you have Alexander Hamilton, and on the right, you have Benjamin Franklin. And in the United States, we have a deep and long and rich history with apprenticeship. These two gentlemen started their careers as apprentices. You have Alexander Hamilton, who in the West Indies was a trading apprentice. And as a result of his experiences, we have him to thank not just for the $10 bill, but also for our customs and for our Coast Guard. So that's Alexander Hamilton. Benjamin Franklin, he actually failed at his first apprenticeship. Sorry, Ben. He started as an apprentice in the cutlery space. Didn't work out so well for him, but fortunately for all of us, he then moved on to printing. And of course became one of the most important first printers of our nation. And we have him to thank as well for the $100 bill.
So as we look at the history of apprenticeship in the United States, one of the key moments was in 1937 with the passage of the Fitzgerald Act. In essence, this is a national apprenticeship act. One of the challenges that they were looking at governmentally was making sure that apprenticeship, which did exist in the US, didn't become indentured servitude. And so this was about wage protection and protecting these young apprentices. There were other very significant components of that persist to this day. The notion of nationally registered apprenticeship. Now, what we have in the United States doesn't actually compare to what you have here, where when someone graduates or finishes an apprenticeship and gets a certificate, it has very specific meaning all throughout the country. In the United States, most examples of registered apprenticeship can be specific to one program at one company, although there are some, like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which are more national and where there is very specific meaning to that type of registration.
So at the same time that apprenticeship was happening and then the recognition of protecting people and workers, you also had in the United States some amazing advancements in access to education. At the turn of the 20th century was when education became required up through the 9th grade. And it really advanced the United States in the Industrial Revolution and how we were preparing our people for the future. By the mid-1940s, you had half of our nation going up through high school, which is exceptional across the globe. In 1944, the GI Bill passed. And what that did was it gave access to any returning veterans from the war to higher education. It democratized access to higher education. And when we're speaking with American audiences, we frequently ask, who here has been touched in some way by the GI Bill? And about half the hands go up. So whether it's a parent, a brother, a sister, themselves, it really has affected the shape and face of the United States. The unintended consequence of it, however, was to then insert a higher education degree, and generally a university degree, as a prerequisite to access to the American dream. And you see story after story in the United States around so-and-so is the first in their family to go to get university degree, which is certainly admirable. But what it has done is it has shrunken the prestige and the power of access to other paths to success.
So when you talk about apprenticeship in the United States, public perception is such that, so here are different examples of apprenticeship. So the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, or NIMS is the National Institute for Metalworking Skills, or up on the far right you have carpenter training. When you say apprentice in the United States, most people tend to think of plumbers, carpenters, welders, building trades. They know those are good jobs. They know those are jobs that pay well. They don't necessarily think about those as paths of opportunity, that parents don't necessarily want their kids at 15 to become a carpenter and think that that's really a great thing.
In the United States, from a public perception standpoint, when you talk about European apprenticeship models, and Jack, I'm going to go to what you were saying before, oftentimes people think about the German model. Now, why do they do that? Well, the Germans have very successfully, through the German-American Chamber of Commerce and their chambers all across the globe, created systems by which German companies in those regions can certify against the German model. They've put a lot of money against marketing their system, and they've made it very collaborative between the countries and the German system in Germany. So when people think about European apprenticeship models, they're frequently thinking about manufacturing apprenticeship that Germany has. And while it is awesome that that's the case, and in fact you had, for example, Angela Merkel come to the White House and have a roundtable with President Trump, with Ivanka Trump, and with business leaders, one of the challenges about it, and we'll talk about it in a few moments, is that it does not have the same permeability that you have here in Switzerland. And there's other elements of it as well that contribute to this perception that becoming an apprentice is something that you are then going to do for the rest of your life. If you do a cheesemaker apprenticeship, you are a cheesemaker for the rest of your life. If you are becoming a carpenter, you are a carpenter for the rest of your life. And in the German model, although there are adaptations and they're looking at it and there are exceptions to it for sure, that is contributing to this public perception that we have in the United States around apprenticeship.
So we spend a lot of time for US audiences explaining the Swiss dual education system. I'm going to give you more a spin on what we think some of the key differences are in particular from a Swiss perspective. Now, as it happens, many states in the United States really are actually of a roughly similar size and scope in terms of both population and size of economy to Switzerland as a country. And in general, our strategy to evangelize this has really been at the state level. When we were here, we had 4 different governors from very diverse states, Delaware, Texas, Michigan, and Colorado, all come and visit. And we saw without fail that governors in particular, when you started to explain elements of the Swiss system or when they would visit companies, they got it, because they think about business, they think about the workplace, they think about how to get people into jobs. And so at the state level, also because our education is driven at a state level, that is the natural holding point. And so here, for example, is a comparison of our home state, Washington State, to Switzerland. And actually, many of the metrics, key industries, are actually shockingly similar. So this obviously is a chart that I think is presented. Every company we visited here had a flavor of this chart. You see it all. Now, we sit in the yellow box. We stand right here in one of the greatest academic institutions of the world. But what's amazing about this system and what's unique and really captivates U.S. audiences is the notion that here it starts so young, that as early as the 7th grade, companies are coming and talking to kids throughout society about potential careers, that kids are doing schnuppen or stage, in the 8th grade, and then in the 9th grade, that 70% of kids are starting. That really challenges U.S. sensibilities. At the same time, in the United States, we have 12 years of mandatory education as compared to the 9 here. So that, again, that youth is a big, big deal. The number that grabs everyone's attention, though, is the fact that right now your unemployment is, the numbers move around, but overall unemployment is 3.2% this month, and youth unemployment is 3.4%. Last month it was 2.8%. The fact that those two numbers are in lockstep is really unique in the world. There are basically very few other economies that have that, and that's definitely not the case in the United States. And so even the fact that you have a system, and there's natural progressions, and that there's permeability, that whether you start in high school or whether you start as an apprentice, that no paths are closed. Those are the things that really sort of blow people away about this model.
Also, when I was at Microsoft, I saw education models all over the globe, and the big focus there was on 21st century skills and project-based learning. And the most innovative in the schools in the world are focusing on these areas. So what we also emphasize is that in Switzerland, in the apprenticeship programs, it is the ultimate delivery of those 21st century skills and project-based learning, but with a paycheck and a heck of a lot more dignity.
So Suzi mentioned, we visited hundreds of companies when we were here. We met thousands of apprentices. This was a young man at EMS Chemie. He was a chemical engineer. Without fail, he was 16. He was a native German speaker talking to the very scary U.S. ambassador in English. She is really scary, isn't she? But without fail, every apprentice we met here, 15, 16, 17, 18, they felt, frankly, 10 years older in terms of maturity. They were being asked to show up on a daily basis, working with adults, delivering real products and services relative to the rest of the world, relative to the United States. This is unique and powerful and really, sort of a new paradigm for us in many respects.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we have is in the United States, we don't trust our young people. Right? And it's an opportunity to get people to rethink that. When we ask them to step up, they do. When we set high expectations, they exceed them. And this is something that we in the United States need to do. So when we articulate the keys to success here in Switzerland that we can look at and emulate and adapt, or in some cases adopt, it's really going back to this fundamental point that in Switzerland, the apprenticeships here, and we specify in Switzerland because it is the gold standard, they don't define you for life. I can't tell you. Raise your hand here if you have a family member or if you yourself did an apprenticeship. Right? Now, for the people that you know or yourself as an apprentice, are you doing what your apprenticeship was in? Right? No. So it prepares you for life, but it doesn't define you for life, which is a really essential point to bring home, especially to the American parents who are like, over my dead body, you're going to have my kid do the X, Y, or Z for the rest of their life. They want to know that there's a path. Martin earlier talked about Sergio Ermati, or he referenced the CEO of UBS. One of the biggest roadblocks to adoption for this in the United States is the prestige factor. So what we emphasize is we give these illustrations of leaders, and really, frankly, there are too many to include, so we just distill it down to these 4 because it's got geographical diversity. More importantly, it's got diversity of the apprenticeships that they did. It shows the permeability because each of these individuals did higher education afterwards, and it shows the prestige. We have individuals who are leaders in business, leaders in government, leaders in academia. And it allows us to bring it to life with real people that people really look up to.
So the big paradigm shift, especially from a U.S. perspective, is the notion that businesses are actually here creators of talent, not just consumers. Our businesses are very used to people graduating from four-year universities, using that as a proxy to determine who is smartest and most likely to succeed, and basically filtering them out. The fact that last year Swiss companies invested $5.8 billion, or 1% of GDP, into this system is something that just blows people's minds. And we'll come back throughout the presentation to some other examples of how we present this to governors in relation to their own economies. Another big thing here is in the United States, when you go and talk about these kinds of programs, earn while you learn, apprenticeship, etc., typically companies want to have you talk to what they call their CSR team, corporate social responsibility. Here, you're talking to the core HR teams. This is how your businesses think about how they're going to get talent and get ahead, and that is really a remarkable paradigm. And in general, shareholders here understand that. Every business around the world always says, oh, the most important asset in our business is our people. But at the end of the day, when you look back at, say, the Great Recession in the United States, our businesses at that point had the highest corporate profits ever in their recorded histories at the same time that we were above 10% unemployment, because they basically kicked a bunch of people out of the workforce, and the people who were still there were incredibly productive. They didn't want to lose their jobs. That's not a great paradigm. And so here we were actually, this is in Colorado, and we'll come back and talk about Colorado a lot more, at Wheat Ridge High School. They call themselves the Farmers, and it's actually in a surprisingly rural area just outside of Denver. All of the pennants that you see here are of different universities. Well, imagine that instead what you saw were pennants of companies. Micron, from a Swiss company, is an important company in Colorado, Home Advisor, Pinnacle Assurance. That increasingly we need to talk to our kids about success, not necessarily being about college or university, but about ultimately a career.
So a lot of what, again, Eric talked about this transformation of businesses from consumers of talent to being creators of talent. Well, what do businesses here do? And again, it's a very natural skill here for folks to have, but they collaborate. So the associations where it's co-opetition, where you have the companies who are vigorous competitors coming together to define the competencies and the curriculum that are needed, where they recognize the investment that they need to make, and where they are really working hard, paying their fair share, where the lion's share of the money going into this, 60% of the funds versus 30% for the cantons and 10% for the federal government. What's fun is when you speak with legislators in the United States, because they're like, what tax incentives do we need, right? And what are the ways, where do we need to step up and fund and create? And we're like, stop. The businesses need to do this. The businesses are the ones who are begging for talent. In Washington state alone, we have almost 750,000 jobs in the next 5 years that are going to be created, and we don't know where the talent's coming from. All right, businesses, let's step up and work together. And that's what the businesses here do, and it's startling and it's a breath of fresh air for the businesses, but also for these other entities in the academic and the government environment as well.
So what do businesses get here by doing this? And a lot of these numbers come from Stefan Wolter in the University of Bern. The end of the day, the reason that 40% of Swiss businesses participate in this system on an annual basis is because they actually make money doing it. They get a positive rate of return during those apprenticeships of anywhere from 7 to 10%, and that's in aggregate, obviously. That notion that this isn't charity, that apprentices will do real work, and that you can mix skilled and unskilled labor as people are getting more productive on the skilled labor, and treat them like adults, that is novel, and it is really quite unique, even actually relative to the German system, where actually there's a lot of union tensions, and they don't want the apprentices to be too productive, and they try to throttle how much real work they can actually do. This, by the way, none of this even gets into the lifelong benefits and the retention. It's what's hard to measure is what would those businesses be able to do without that talent. And time again, as we talked to different CEOs, what they would say, when we would ask them, how can you afford to do this? Without fail, it was like a script. They would say, how can we afford not to? Now, their CFOs were probably more concerned about the numbers. And at the end of the day, the reason it succeeds here is because enough businesses are doing it, that they can actually make money doing it. And that is an incredibly powerful thing, and it's unique. It really is a very special, mature ecosystem that you have here.
And in fact, going back to the point of Federal Counselor Schneider-Ammann going to Silicon Valley to have those conversations around innovation, innovation is not possible without the talent. And they're struggling right now to find enough talent to build up their developer base and to build up all of the pipelines that they need. And so this is a key area that many tech companies are looking at, and they don't know how to do it. And so again, we keep pointing them back here. And again, they can't just be competitors, they have to be cooperators. So adapting this model to the United States. So the stars are aligning in the US. Over the course of history, whether it was Reagan, whether it was Bush, whether it was Clinton, there have been a lot of efforts to push forward apprenticeship. But by and large, it was coming from government saying, what can we do to improve our workforce? But there's so many other factors now that are making it important to look at new paradigms or old paradigms in new ways. In this particular case, what is the citizen perspective on this? In the United States right now, we have $1.3 trillion in college debt that is spread across 44 million people in our country. An enormous burden that we are bearing as a result of both the expense, but also this prerequisite to have this degree. And yet at the same time, when you look at job descriptions, they say a 4-year university degree required, but only 30% of Americans have a university degree. And while we have been able to reduce our unemployment, Eric was talking about the highest unemployment during the recession, it's come down to about 4.4%. But for youth unemployment, that's 9.6%. And if you look in certain communities, like the African American community, it's 16%. So it's disproportionate across different groups, and we have relatively slow, we do have wage growth, it's just that it's relatively slow. That's the citizen stars that are aligning.
From a business perspective right now, there are 6.2 million jobs right now that businesses would like to fill, and they cannot find the talent. There's a fundamental mismatch between the workforce and the skills they have and what the businesses need. A term, we hear different terms that typically will incorporate silver or gray, and it's a reference to hair color. Boeing talks about a silver tsunami, a tidal wave of engineers that are going to retire over the next 5 years. When you talk to people in the insurance industry, they talk about the graying of the insurance industry. You know, with sort of the baby boomers, there are going to be in every industry an enormous number of people retiring over the next 5 to 10 years. And how are businesses going to replace that talent? And in general, again, businesses today largely use degrees, 4-year degrees, as a proxy for skills. But increasingly, we do see interest in businesses actually starting to talk about what are the skills we need for a particular job and not using a university degree as a proxy. And in general, the way that we teach in the United States hasn't really changed in more than a century. It is still largely aligned around an agrarian society and very frontal teaching.
So when we were here in Switzerland, we were able to do a lot in moving the ball forward of bringing that Swiss model to the United States. One of the biggest steps was signing an agreement, a joint declaration of intent that persists today across administrations, I'm very proud to say, that is a collaboration between our two countries to learn together, to look at some of the roadblocks to sharing across different companies. How do you address things like visas and things like that? With the agreements being signed in our Department of Commerce, Department of Education, and Department of Labor. And here you have a couple of those moments with our former Secretary of Commerce and our former Secretary of Labor. And this is a visit in the middle to Pilatus. One of the best examples of that, though, is that of Zurich Insurance. And this is not an example of my great selfie skills, unfortunately.
A little fuzzy.
So it's a little fuzzy. So they had made a commitment, Martin Sen, may he rest in peace, the former CEO of Zurich Insurance, when I asked him, what does he need to expand his footprint in the United States? The answer was, we need talent. And time again, when we would say, hey, what can we do to increase your investment in the United States? They would say, we need talent. Or if they're looking for where to go, who has the talent? So I said to Martin in that meeting, I said, well, Martin, you have this amazing apprenticeship program. Would you think about bringing it to your United States facilities? And he said, yes. They announced their commitment to doing this in January of 2015 and then launched it by January of 2016. And in most cases in the United States, whether it's Bühler, whether it is FineTool, SFS Group, there's a number of companies that had been doing it, from whom we learned, and then there were more committed to doing it. In most cases, it's post-high school, in partnership with something called community college, which is kind of comparable to Fachhochschule here. I'm sorry, I don't know the French word for it. I just know the German word for it. And if you want to tell me later what the French word is, I'd appreciate that. And Zurich did this. They partnered with Harper Community College, and they created a 2-year program where these individuals, and they started out with a cohort of 25, 3 days a week. This sounds familiar, right? 3 days a week are at Zurich, earning a paycheck, rotating with different jobs, and 2 days a week at Harper Community College. And the innovation there was especially Zurich, the company creating the competencies and the curriculum in partnership with the academic institution. But like a good Swiss company, they didn't just think about themselves. They thought about the ecosystem. So a month after they launched, they held a meeting in Chicago with other financial services companies. And now Aon, which is a British company, The Hartford, an American company, and Pinnacle Assurance, which is down in Colorado, then you also have JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, are all using certain components of the Zurich system that they have brought to the United States. So a Swiss company having a really profound impact and mentoring many others. And the exposure that they've gotten has been amazing. Features in the Chicago Tribune, they've been included in White House roundtables, they've been included in Department of Labor events. It's been profound for Zurich and their footprint and exposure in the United States, but most importantly, it's helping them grow great talent.
One other key thing there is, this is financial services, right? This is insurance industry. This is white collar. Again, go back to what I talked about earlier, that you say apprentice, people think blue collar and just working with your hands. So starting to broaden the notion, here you have more than about 238, I think, current different pathways, and that's incredibly important. It covers software developer all the way to cheesemaker, and for the US, that is novel. So Suzi talked about the fact that
I know, I'm working on it.
talked about the fact that in most cases in the US, this is happening post-high school, and that's a natural reflection of the fact that we have 12 years of mandatory education, that kids have to finish high school. And in general, reforming school systems is one of the more challenging things in our political system. Now, the really interesting example to watch is Colorado. So I mentioned 4 governors that visited, including Governor Hickenlooper from Colorado. It actually started in the summer of 2015. A particular business leader went to ETH, to a boot camp. There's a sort of an economics institute there focused on the economics of this overall system in Switzerland and around the world. And he came with Denver Public Schools. He was going to stay for 3 days. He stayed for 2 weeks, and he got very passionate. He was texting with Governor Hickenlooper from the Zurich airport saying, John, we've got to get people over here. And then also in January of 2016, they came with a delegation of about 45 people. And it was a very intelligently composed delegation. They had government leaders from the state, academic leaders. A third of the group were business leaders, and they also had philanthropists, both national ones and some Colorado-specific ones. They looked at the entire system for almost a week, and it was really a transformational experience, almost emotional, where we were with them on their first day and on their last evening. And on the last evening, Governor Hickenlooper went around the room, sort of whipped them up, and did a commitment ceremony where he asked each person in the delegation individually, in front of the whole group, when you go back to Colorado, what are you going to do differently? Now, what they ended up doing 9 months later, they decided to create a nonprofit called CareerWise Colorado. It's a public-private partnership, so there's some money from the state, but most of the money is philanthropic. And what CareerWise is doing, they have a 10-year goal. They're doing apprenticeship in conjunction with the junior and senior year of high school, and then a third year with community college, sort of like a gap year when people finish high school. Kids will graduate school on time. They're actually concurrently enrolled in high school and community college. They're earning college credit, so if they do go on to university, they're not starting from scratch. They've actually taken advantage of all 3 of those years, so almost a running start. And they're doing this in a number of different pathways, not the building trades. They're doing advanced manufacturing, IT, business operations, and financial services. Their 10-year goal is 10% of those high school juniors and seniors, or about 20,000 kids a year doing this. In Switzerland, it's each cohort each year is about 80,000. So even for them, just doing 10% would be a really, really big deal. Now, right now, year one, they're in their first cohort right now, real kids doing real work. It's 116 kids in 40 companies. They're actively recruiting for year two, where they're adding also healthcare as a fifth pathway. And it is novel in that they are both doing this in high school, but in the United States, this is the only model where there is a unified statewide vision, and it is directly informed by the Swiss model. There are people regularly going back and forth between Colorado and Switzerland and studying this, but they are trying to build something that works for their economy and their businesses and all of the different needs there, and it's very powerful. This is an example, actually. So PBS, so our national public broadcasting service, came and did a little quick documentary on this. About, I think, 50 million people saw this. So Suzi's going to press play. Here we go.
Looking to fine-tune their apprentice program, Colorado leaders traveled to Switzerland, where 40% of companies offer student apprenticeships.
So why apprenticeship? Swiss firms do not only train because it's a tradition. There is an economic rationale.
It is an investment into young people for making sure that we have got a lower unemployment rate.
Suzi LeVine, former U.S. ambassador to Switzerland, hosted the delegation and is now working with Colorado's Career-Wise Apprentice program.
We're at the front end of an apprenticeship renaissance in the United States.
So another local example of apprenticeship that's happening in the US, we've been very excited that Nestle is going to be rolling this out, and it has already started the rollout to all 180 of their facilities across the United States. And not just thinking about apprenticeship writ large, and the average apprentice age in the United States is actually 28 years old. That's down from 37 where it used to be, but that they are also exploring and rolling out youth apprenticeship. So when we look across the United States, you have common skill needs across those states. Now, Eric and I have had conversations and are working with 12 different governors and or their staffs. And what we hear and see very consistently are these three areas. And it's useful to help them understand, because the states are oftentimes not in touch with each other. So it's very useful to point out to them, you know what, Washington State, you're not the only one that's focusing on aerospace and on advanced manufacturing. Talk to the folks in California. Rhode Island, trust me, you're not the only ones who are worried about your maritime workers. It's important to bring that all together. And IT, healthcare, advanced manufacturing are key industries that they have a dearth of skilled labor right now that are all looking at this very deeply.
So the general challenge in the United States is, what you have built here is an amazing ecosystem with 40% of your businesses, all of your cantons participating. The notion of a national apprenticeship model in the United States would be like boiling all of the world's oceans. It's too big to contemplate. But as we already mentioned, what we are seeing is amazing traction in Colorado and amazing interest at a state-by-state level. And one of the very powerful things, of course, are that Swiss companies, German companies, Austrian companies, what you need when you're trying to start something like this out are people who are familiar with the model, who don't have cultural biases, and really can be leaders. And so in every state we go to, we point out to those states the number of jobs and the number of businesses of either Swiss or German origin, that if they're looking for 5, 10, 15, 20 companies to be leaders, they need to get some Swiss companies in there because consistently they get it. Or in other cases, we've actually run across American companies, but where a given leader in the local area is actually a Swiss person. So the W Hotels, huge international chain, the head of their GM in their San Francisco hotel is a Swiss guy. Or actually, there's a new hotel starting.
And he started as a chef apprentice here in Switzerland.
Yeah. So it's really basically that the more that people can borrow, think of it as a jump starter for an engine, that in essence.
We actually just had a conversation the other day with the Los Angeles Metro, the folks who do all the transportation systems in Los Angeles. And they saw us present at the California Workforce Association and asked us then to present and or talk with their broader staff. And we were reminded of, Eric was about to talk about a gentleman who's the general manager of the San Francisco Proper Hotel. It's a new hotel there, you should check it out. And he started at SBB, where he was, as an apprentice, changing the trains from track to track. And so for them, it was an emphasis on don't just think about people coming through as transportation engineers or transportation apprentices. Think about how you're equipping them for life. And it was a huge aha moment for them. Oh my gosh, how are we thinking about people becoming small business owners? How are we thinking about people becoming entrepreneurs, even though they may be learning core basic skills around transportation? So one of the things that we've seen in state after state after state in the United States is that there are amazing programs. Sorry, this is not from a Swiss hike. This was when we were up in Canada. We did have one from a Swiss hike, but I liked this a little better. They have amazing, beautiful programs, and they're like a field of wildflowers, beautiful colors and shapes. There's occasional weeds, but they're pointed in lots of different directions. And what we recognize that Switzerland has...
Actually, does anyone know what this is?
Somebody read
Jim
the
said
bottom.
aspen.
It is. So this is one of the oldest organisms in the world. This stand of aspens is one organism. And this is in Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. Very beautiful. You should go there. You'll see this, especially in the fall. And this is what the Swiss system is. There are some individualities within it, either across cantons or within the individual businesses, but it functions as a system. And especially in government, where you're challenged and the opportunity with people who are running for office every 2 or 4 years, or in some cases every 6 years, they think in terms of programs, not systems. And it takes longer, and it takes a lot more work to build a system. And so we really try to impart this to business leaders, government leaders, academic leaders, and philanthropists.
So one of the little exercises we do, and this is total fantasy land, but to get people's attention when we go and visit a governor or a given state, we take a couple of the key metrics from your mature ecosystem. We take the fact that, again, businesses are investing 1% of GDP every year, and we extrapolate that across a given state's economy. So whether it's Nevada, whether it is Washington State, and we'll pause on California. You know, if California businesses did that, California would be the 6th largest GDP in the world as a standalone country, soon to be number 5. They'll pass UK post-Brexit. So 1% of GDP would be $25 billion per year. But frankly, even if they only got 10% or 1% of that, it would be a significant number in terms of investment in workforce and education. Now, I bet a lot of folks here don't know this, but okay, so 70% of people in the Swiss system, 70% of Swiss students are doing apprenticeship, 30% are doing college or gymnasium. Do you know that apprentices here are 40% cheaper than people going through the academic path during those high school years? It's fewer days per week is the main thing. So we'll point out, in every state that we visit, all of them are under great economic pressure for their public school systems. And so if they could steer even 10 or 20% of their students down another pathway and get the businesses, in essence, by getting the businesses involved, having kids learning at work and not in school every day, they could save an enormous amount of money. So it's, again, even if we just got a fraction of it, it's what you have is an incredible ecosystem with education and the federal government and the businesses working in a really harmonious way. And the societal benefits of this are remarkable. So people in the United States talk on and on and on about people being college ready or college and career ready. Because again, what you call university, we call college. And we just are encouraging people to stop talking about college. That's a great path, but really it's all about being career ready. And the societal benefits, and you see them here, of people being employed. At the end of the day, the dignity of work and low unemployment generates so many benefits and solves so many problems. And then the economic advantages of companies actually having all the talent they need. So that is the exercise that we go through with folks.
What we recognize is that in the United States, there are some very big cultural shifts that are going to be needed to bring this to fruition. One is companies going from being consumers of talent to creators of talent. Another is how do you go from there being a stigma associated with apprenticeship to being status, to being prestigious. How? Now here at this university, one of the beautiful things is that yes, university is one of those paths, but there are many paths. And in fact, here in this university, you have people who have gone through an apprenticeship and then are now studying here. But university to many paths, from a dead end to permeability? How do you make sure that our institutions are designed in a way to be able to receive those credentials, and not just receive, but to value those credentials? And in fact, Eric and I are organizing a delegation from Washington State with our governor, much like the Colorado delegation that he described. And we're so excited. We're going to have 2 of our university presidents come from the University of Washington and Washington State so that they can see this permeability and recognize the importance of their role in this system. And again, going back to that point before, from the field to the Aspens, going from programs to systems.
So as Suzi just mentioned, seeing is believing. So at the end of the day, while we were here, we were trying to get governors and business leaders to come and look at the model. We will be back in just a month, actually, with a large delegation from Washington State and our governor, just like what Colorado did to try to replicate that experience, bringing business, academic, philanthropic, and government leaders together for nearly a week. But what you have here is really unique and special and powerful.
So with that, we thank you so much for the opportunity to share both how we've been interpreting and working on adapting the Swiss model, and we want to open it up for a conversation and questions. We have about 15 minutes for that.
13, you're in Switzerland. You got to be very precise.
13. Thank you very much. And we fully expect corrections, actually, from Pierre Dillenborg and others, where we may need to adapt and adjust our own presentations. And if you could share your name, please, that would be really great.
Microphone is coming.
Right, thank you. My name's Peter Butterfield, American living here in Switzerland. A question on this: in the Swiss model, what's the sort of lower limit in size of an enterprise at which the apprenticeship model applies? I mean, can a company with 10 people be part of that, or is that too small?
In Switzerland, there's no lower limit for size of company, but what they frequently find, and I will cite the work that we have looked at from CMETS, which is the institute at ETH, and a woman named Ursula Reynold, who was featured on that slide. She's sort of the global guru on this. What you have is smaller companies coming in and out, because they may not need an apprentice every year, right? So if it's a hairdresser shop, right, they may be at capacity, or a baker, they may be at capacity. So there's no lower limit on the size, but there is that they may not have the capacity to absorb an apprentice every year. Or what you'll also find is that they may collaborate together, so that I may not get all my skills at one place, I may do my rotation across companies. A good example of that in St. Gallen is that you have this collection, you have Vectronics, you have SFS Group and others coming together where the apprentices are getting different skills across the companies, because no one company can fulfill all of the competencies within a particular credential. So that's how things are handled in the Swiss model here. In the United States, where we don't yet have that cooperation happening across the companies, that's where intermediaries are really valuable, because they can bootstrap that for those companies. So in Colorado, for example, CareerWise is giving that, again, that bootstrap, that support for smaller companies. So does that answer your question, Peter?
Yeah, the key concept, of course, is that while 40% of the businesses each year participate here, it's basically pervasive amongst larger businesses because they have sort of more ability to absorb more folks. But the key thing is that there is a critical mass. Mm-hmm. And in the United States, historically, if you see one company doing a really great training program and no one else is doing it around them, the other companies come in and just scoop away the talents. And so that's sort of the differentiation between a program and a system. If you get enough people doing it, then it raises the talent pool for all of the companies.
You also have here in Switzerland that some of the bigger companies are hosting apprenticeship for smaller companies. So whether it is Weidmann, who does insulation for transformers, whether it is Schindler, who does elevators and escalators, many of the members of their supply chain are participating in apprenticeship at their facilities. And the benefit is that they then know that their suppliers and or their customers have great quality employees. But also, if you're ABB, if you're ABB, and you're training folks, when somebody then goes to become the procurement manager at some other company, they've been training on your equipment. What are they going to buy? Nice opportunity. So it is a much broader sense of both responsibility, but of how are you making sure that all boats rise?
Take another question.
Next question. Professor Dillenburg.
In Switzerland, the system is not actually dual. In many cases, there is a third learning place. So once or twice per year, they go for 1 week or 2 weeks in a centre interprofessionnel, a vocational center, which is managed totally by the corporate association. Only the case where the corporate association is very powerful, they have centers where the kids can practice equipment that would not exist in the SMEs or something like that. Do you have these kind of centers managed by you, corporate association? Are the corporate associations strong enough to build such centers?
So one example, so in Colorado, actually, so you have an amazing center called LIBS is in a couple of places, but there's one, it's spun out of ABB here in Switzerland. The Colorado group went and saw that, and they issued a bond, so they're building a $40 million shared manufacturing training facility in Colorado based on LIBS because they were so blown away by what they saw. You know, in general, our industry associations don't think about themselves as the centers of defining academic competencies. And that is one of the big shifts. Again, that's what businesses do here through the associations. And so that's part of the muscle we need to build up.
The other comparison in the United States, sort of what the unions do. Or in Washington State, we have something called AJAC, the Aerospace Joint Apprenticeship Committee, that is doing some of that centralized training. But other examples here include CYP, which is for the banking sector, or CAREM, which is for the healthcare sector, where you have that centralized training. And so we are providing that kind of exposure because we do think that that's going to be another essential part of how do we adapt and adopt and have standards of excellence that are consistent across industries. But your point is a great one. And we had, Jack is going to ask a question, then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, it's somewhat related to what Peter brought up. I should think that the larger companies would be much stronger.
You have a microphone coming to you. Thank you so much.
I would think that the larger companies, both in Switzerland and anywhere else, would be the leaders in apprenticeship training. The middle-sized companies, as you said, there's some borrowing that goes on, there's some hosting on the big companies. Do you have any notion of what percentage, this is a general number, but what percentage of the total employees in a middle-sized company of some size would come from the apprenticeship background as opposed to the larger companies? Do you have any sense of that? Because
You saying in Switzerland or in the US?
Something you know about. If it's Switzerland, fine.
I don't know. I mean, I know that like many of the manufacturing companies we visited here, medium and large, would have populations of anywhere from 6, the highest we saw I think was 11 or 12% of the overall employee population being apprentices. Generally it was lower in white collar, we were seeing 3 to 5%. Still pretty remarkable numbers overall though.
But that's not the percentage of current employees who happen to have come from apprenticeship. So we don't know. It's a great question. And again, the research may exist that articulates it, but that isn't something that we've yet learned. But we can certainly ask and see if we can get the answer to you.
Because I think that, well, we can talk about it generally, but I think that connects to your point of moving programs to systems.
Yeah.
So.
It's very true. Thank you. Pierre, did you have another question? Okay, thank you. Yes, please. And if you have questions and you don't think of them now or you want to ask them later in a more private setting, you can also reach out via Facebook and Twitter. And as people here probably know, I'm pretty active on that. And I'm happy to field those questions through that vehicle too.
Hi, I'm Kate Edson from Basel. Did you happen to look at the pharmaceutical industry and apprentices?
Absolutely. Having visited Roche especially, and then also CSL Behring. In fact, our delegation is going to go to CSL Behring. We were very impressed with the integration of pharmaceutical employees. It's interesting because the same apprenticeship applies whether you're at Dow Chemical, whether you're Givaudan, whether you're in Roche or Novartis or CSL Behring.
Right, lab technicians.
Lab technician. And in fact, we have one of the members of our delegation is the head of the Life Sciences Association from Washington State, whose job it is to think about how do you provide qualified staff. And so we're very excited about the potential in that space, especially around pharmaceuticals. So the answer is yes, absolutely.
Okay, I have a microphone, so I'll go ahead. My name is Sabine Sestrunk. Thank you for the compliment for the Swiss Apprenticeship system. but it's not quite all in gold. So our system has a problem with bias, and our bias is against names that are not the typical Swiss names. How would you deal in the American system with the bias that probably will also exist for
Can I
maybe a
take this
different
one?
kind of thing?
So I would encourage you to check out the Technische Fachschule in Bern and see the program that Matthias Zurbuchen has created to help refugees in particular from Somalia, Eritrea, from Afghanistan, and from Syria, and look at some of the work that they're doing there to get them engaged and involved. That's more focused on refugees as opposed to diversity writ large. In the United States, one of the challenges that we have is that the historical system of, they called it VOTEC for a while, then they called it career and technical education. But when I was growing up and I was in high school, it was those kids who did VOTEC, right? It was, well, you didn't quite cut the mustard, so you got to learn this instead. And what we've been really emphasizing is that for it to succeed in the United States, it's got to be for all kids. And how you address the needs of underserved communities, or as they're now called, opportunity youth, is access. How do you make sure that you have the proper transportation for everybody? How do you help communities where they haven't learned some of the fundamental etiquette skills? And how do you make sure that you're getting dressed appropriately and getting places on time? That's access. So how are you providing the support through access in the United States? But you saw that picture of Zurich Insurance. There is diversity involved in this, and when we look across and we meet the folks from Colorado, there is diversity baked into it, depending regionally, of course, but that is one key factor.
One other big challenge we will have to scale this is, as in Switzerland, there are both large urban and rural populations. Here you have, your infrastructure with trains and postbus is just beyond compare. And so it is entirely feasible for someone living in a rural environment at age 15 to be able to go within an hour most anywhere in the country and to be employed. And we do not have that in the same way. It's actually, so we were just talking with Pierre about distance learning and what you are doing even here to sort of push the envelopes around that. But that will even be more important in the US, and it will be a real challenge for us to scale this.
So we'll take one more question now with the group, and then...
She's got the mic.
I know, she's got it. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll stick around, but I know that there's other things that this amazing institution has organized in terms of eating and things like that. So I would ask also that other questions you can field to us and on social media too, but please.
Yep. Hello, my name's Carol.
Make it a good one, it's the last one.
Well, I'm not all rosy. My name's Carol McGowan. I work as an architect in a small office. To address your question, we have less than 20 people, 3 of whom are apprentices. They're often seen as lower cost labor. But there's a lot of structure in the apprentice system. But as a mother of 2 children who are in university here, there's a lot of frustration in junior high with this apprentice system. I'm an American, my kids were born and raised here, and those junior high years were for us awful because there's a lot of frustration with, if you think your kids are college material, you don't get the support in the schools. I found as an American there was a lot of support missing, especially for kids in hindsight. Like I said, both of my kids are in university now. People who tend to be more creative, those creative skills aren't necessarily recognized because those kids are seeing, well, we can put them into the apprenticeship system. Most kids thrive, but some people fall through the cracks. And I think that that's something that I'm not sure the United States business landscape will be able to handle that as well as it actually is handled in Switzerland.
So if I understand your comment, it is more of the Swiss system is actually more oriented towards apprenticeship, the apprenticeship route, as opposed to the college and gymnasium route, and as a result, those individuals who are more academically oriented or theoretical learning oriented are not as well supported through those middle years. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think there was another element also, that the school being very focused on very structured kinds of learning, and so someone who is more artistic and creative kind of gets squeezed in that kind of a system. Yeah.
We don't have that problem in the United States because we don't have really an apprenticeship model. We are all creative all the time, and there's tremendous value in that. And in fact, I wish we were more in terms of the arts being baked into our schools. But I think that we in the United States are learning from the Swiss model, and I think it's an adaptation. And as we frequently talk to folks, a lot of times people will come back and say, Heidi, you're telling me you're going to track my kid over my dead body.
Right, tracking is the
Right.
big elephant in the room, which we don't talk about in the US. We do not imagine 70% of kids doing this. We do not imagine people being tracked or forced down a path. We're like, how do we open up a path so 10 or 15% of kids could do this, and it works better for them?
But going back to the businesses, it will work if companies like Salesforce and Microsoft and GE and name your fantastic company with great jobs opens this up for apprenticeship and no longer thinks about what degree does somebody need to have to come in to work here, but how do we partner to create more talent, and how do we think in terms of skills and not just degrees? And so we can learn from what you are saying. I do not think we are at risk of the pendulum swinging in that direction in the United States, but it is a very good point to keep in mind, because you're right that sometimes when people get excited about this in the United States, and we've been speaking with a lot of candidates running for all levels of office from both parties, because we're very bipartisan on this focus, and everybody has a jobs platform, and everybody is talking about, we need apprenticeship. They don't know what that means, so we're helping them, but to help them also make sure that they don't overcorrect in focusing on practical education at the cost of theoretical and creative arts education. So thank you very much for that very important perspective, Carol. Again, we want to be respectful of time, especially since we're in Switzerland.
How do we do?
And we thank you.
On behalf of EPFL and Martin, let me thank you both for this excellent lecture and for coming back to Switzerland to tell us what you took back to the U.S. from Switzerland.
Awesome.
Thank you,
so
Suzi.
much, Jim.
Eric.
And as Suzi said, she'll be here if you want to ask questions now.